Hey everyone, welcome to Slurs and Stereotypes. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on how negative stereotypes can cause Christians to underperform in and disidentify with science. So, in the last few lectures, we've been focusing on slurs. We spent the first few weeks of the course exploring various empirical articles from social psychology that investigated the use of slurs both in hate speech, so their derogatory use by outgroup members, as well as exploring the use of slurs in the context of reappropriation or reclamation, so the use of slurs among in-group members. The purpose of exploring the use of slurs in both their derogatory and comparatively non-derogatory contexts was to appreciate the complexity of slurs and their various uses. We're going to turn now for this lecture, as well as in the next few lectures, to the topic of stereotypes. In particular, we're going to use the article for today to explore how negative stereotypes can cause Christians to underperform in and disidentify with science. In the next few lectures, we'll also explore the positive stereotypes or positive uses of stereotypes. Okay, but the article that we read for today was entitled "Negative Stereotypes Cause Christians to Underperform in and Disidentify with Science." And this article was published in the journal Social, Psychological, and Personality Science in 2015 by Rios, Chang, Totten, and Sheriff. This article consists of 5 different studies, so we'll go ahead and look through each of the studies in turn. Okay, and what we're going to do today is both appreciate the nature of the results as well as the methodology for arriving at those results. And that's just as important for us as cognitive scientists, because what we aim to do is ultimately replicate and extend some of this work. So, experiment 1 in this study, what was the purpose of this experiment? Well, the purpose of experiment 1 was to investigate the social stereotypes and personal beliefs of different groups. The methods used for this study include the following. Okay, so this research group recruited 202 participants from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is a way to do some crowdsourcing. Participants provided demographic information and religious affiliation. Participants then rated 4 groups on their social stereotypes. And the 4 groups that were the focus of this study include atheists, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Participants used scales to rate these groups on 4 stereotypical attributes, including overall competence, competence in science, trust in science, and warmth. The way that overall competence was measured was with a scale from 1 to 3, where 1 represents less competent in general than the average person, and 3 represents more competent in general than the average person. This is overall competence. Next, in order to measure competence in science, participants used a scale from 1, less competent in science, to 3, more competent in science. So you might think, of a particular group, how competent in science are Asian Americans, for example? And you might think they're really competent in science, or maybe you think they're not. This is the idea here. Okay, we're trying to get a measure of competence in science. Next, we want to get a measure of trust in science. So participants used a scale ranging from 1, less trusting in science than the average person, to 3, more trusting in science than the average person. And then warmth, social or interpersonal warmth, was measured with a scale ranging from 1 for less warm than the average person, to 3 for more warm than the average person. This first part right here, this was to measure stereotypes, social stereotypes about groups, right? So I might ask you, what do you think common stereotypes about Asian Americans are, or atheists, or Christians, Jews, and Muslims? for example. But also, I might ask you a distinct question, regardless of what the social stereotype is for those groups. What's your personal belief about them, right? I might have an understanding that this is the stereotype for Christians or atheists, but I might personally have a different belief about those group members. Okay. So, in addition to assessing social stereotypes of these groups, in experiment one, these researchers also investigated or asked questions about personal beliefs about these groups. So participants rated their personal beliefs about each group using the same scales and characteristics in order to assess whether participants actually endorsed the societal stereotypes about the four groups. All right, so study one, we just want to figure out like, what are the stereotypes for these different groups, right? What do people think about Christians? What do people think about atheists, about Jews and Muslims, right? And the most important thing for this article is going to be Christians, okay? So we'll be focusing on results for Christians, but we'll also talk about some of the other results because they're pretty interesting, okay? So here's the results from experiment one. We'll go ahead and look at the figure here, okay? So this is figure one, and we see that this is for social stereotypes for the four groups, okay? And here we can see that the four groups include Christians in this darkest shaded box, atheists for a lighter shaded box, Jews for a lighter box with stripes, and then Muslims have a darker box with stripes, okay? Along the horizontal axis or the x-axis, we see that we have competence in science here, working our way from left to right. Trust in science is next. General competence is after that. And then finally, we have warmth on the right side. Okay. Now, on the vertical or y-axis, we have perceived stereotype score. Okay. And 0 will represent sort of the average. Okay, so the average person, right? And then if we're going up, then that means that this particular group is higher with respect to this feature than the average person. And if we're going below 0, then that just means that this group is lower than the average person with respect to this feature. Okay. So we can go ahead and look through the figure first. Okay. Let's go ahead and just look at Christians first. So Christians are represented with the darkest color box, and we see that we have Christians here, okay? And so for competence in science, what do we see about Christians? That Christians were lower in competence in science than average, right? Significantly lower, okay? So Christians, lower in competence in science than average. Also, we can move over one to trust in science. We said that Christians are also lower in trust in science than average, right? Next, in terms of general competence, like overall, right? Like in science, cooking, relationships, skateboarding, just like generally competent, right? We see that here, Christians they're equally competent as the average person with respect to general competence. Okay. And then finally, with respect to warmth, social interpersonal warmth, we see that Christians were rated as higher in warmth than the average person. So very interesting, right? One more time, Christians were lower in competence in science than the average person, lower in trust in science than the average person, higher in warmth than the average person, and equal in terms of general competence as the average person. Okay, let's move on to the next group now, atheists. Here we see that atheists are higher in competence in science than the average person. We also see here that atheists are higher in trust in science than the average person. Here we see that atheists are equal in terms of general competence as the average person. And like this, we see right here that this is not statistically significant. Yeah, and you can read the article for the exact values like p-values and whatnot and look at the statistics. Okay, but just inspecting the figure here, we also see that atheists scored lower in warmth than the average person. Okay, so the atheists are stereotyped almost opposite as Christians. Okay, all right. And we'll also look at how Jews and Muslims were stereotyped. So Jews are going to be right here. We see that they're stereotyped as being higher in terms of competence in science than the average person. They're also stereotyped as higher in trust in science than the average person, higher in general competence than the average person, and lower in warmth than the average person. Okay. And finally, Muslims were rated, as we can see here, lower in competence in science than the average person, lower in trust in science than the average person, lower in general competence than the average person, and lower in warmth than the average person. So although it's very common that most groups will be low in certain features like competence, but high in warmth, or be high in warmth and low in competence. But it's rare that we see a group that's low in all, low in competence and warmth. So this is a very interesting result, but also a troubling result, right? Like we should be concerned what's going on with such strongly negative views towards Muslims, that group, okay, in terms of stereotypes about that group, okay? So this wasn't a focus of the article and they don't really discuss this in detail, but this is an interesting result that, we should be thinking about, and perhaps some of you want to carry out research on this topic, okay? And also just notice the publication date. It's in 2015. So maybe we want to ask, has our stereotypes about Muslims changed? Like what was going on in 2015? Was there something that influenced strongly negative stereotypes against that group? And if we replicated the study right now, right, 2022, 2023, will we get the same sort of results? Okay, not a focus of this particular paper, but as you read through the figures, right, you can't help but wonder what's going on with this particular result. Okay, all right. In any case, let's keep it moving. Oh, and one more point, we see that Christians were perceived. So here the first thing I did was sort of went by Christians and I just looked at Christian scores, atheists, Jews, Muslims. But we can also do like a comparative. We can say that Christians were perceived to be stereotyped as lower in competence in science and lower interest in science than all the other groups. Okay. And we see that here. So if we were to ask like which group was considered the least competent in science in terms of their stereotype, and you would see that it's Christians. Okay. Similarly, which group is stereotyped as having the least amount of trust in science? Again, Christians are stereotyped in that way. Okay. So these are just some interesting findings. And we can always ask, what's the cause or influence of these beliefs about these target groups? All right, cool. So we have just looked at the social stereotype figure, okay? But remember that we also wanted to look at individual beliefs, because sometimes our individual beliefs don't line up with social stereotypes, okay? Hopefully they don't. Hopefully we have more nuanced individual beliefs than what's captured in social stereotypes. Okay, so figure 2 shows us a nice figure regarding personal beliefs about groups. Okay, and what we're going to look at on this figure is just focus on how Christians rated Christians, right? Like, how do Christians feel about other Christians? And then we'll look at how non-Christians rated Christians, right? Like, how do non-Christians feel about Christians, right? So on the one hand, we're looking at what in-groups think about each other, right? What fellow in-group members think about each other. And then we're going to look at what an out-group member thinks about that target group. Okay. All right, so we see that Christians rated Christians. So let me just begin from the beginning. It's a nice place to begin. On the X or horizontal axis, we have competence in science, trust in science, general competence, and then warmth. And then on the vertical or y-axis, we have endorsed stereotypes, okay, like individual or personal beliefs. Okay. In the darkest shaded box, we have how Christians, what they think about themselves. Okay. So these are sort of how Christians rate Christians. And then in the lighter shaded box, we have what non-Christians think about Christians, right? Or how outgroup members, non-Christians, rate that target group, Christians. Okay. And let's start with how Christians, what Christians think about Christians. Okay. In terms of competence in science, we see that Christians think that other Christians are equally as competent in science as the average person. So if you're a Christian and I'm a Christian, I think that you're just as good at science as any average person. You being Christian, if I'm Christian, doesn't influence me to think that you're bad at science. Okay. Similarly, when Christians are rating other Christians with respect to their trust in science, they think that other Christians are equally as trusting in science as the average person. Okay. So they don't hold negative personal beliefs about other Christians in this respect, in these two respects. Okay. And then when it comes to general competence and warmth, we see that Christians rate other Christians as higher in general competence and warmth than the average person. Okay. So you can see there's some favorable in-group beliefs here. Okay. So if I'm Christian and you're Christian, I'll think, you're, more competent than the average person and warmer than the average person. Okay. All right, but we see what's interesting is that the results look very different for how non-Christians think about Christians, right? We see here that in terms of competence in science, non-Christians think that Christians are lower in competence in science than the average person. Okay. So if you're a Christian, I'm a non-Christian, I'm going to think you're worse than the average person with respect to your competence in science. Okay. So whereas the Christian doesn't have a negative personal belief with respect to this attribute, a non-Christian does have at least in the study, does have a negative belief with respect to this attribute. Okay. Christians are worse in science than non-Christians. Okay. Similarly, non-Christians see other Christians, non-Christians see Christians as having lower trust in science than the average person. Okay. Here we also see that non-Christians rate Christians as being lower in general competence than the average person. Okay. Less so, this rating is less severe or less extreme than these ratings, but still there's a significant rating here. Okay. But when it comes to warmth, non-Christians are gonna see Christians as equally as warm as the average person. Okay. So what's really interesting here, right, is notice that these beliefs are shifted depending on whether you're an in-group member or an out-group member, right? If you're an in-group member, you sort of have either neutral or positive beliefs about your fellow in-group members. But if you're an out-group member, you have either negative or neutral beliefs, right? So if you're an out-group member, it's like negative or neutral. But then if you're an out-group member, it's negative to neutral. But if you're an in-group member, it's neutral to positive, right? So we see how there's a shift here in individual ratings depending on whether you're an in-group member or an out-group member, right? So it's very interesting, right? Okay, and then here, this is just going to repeat some of the results from the figures, but it's fun for us to practice our ability to read tables. Okay, so let's go ahead and just look at this table and make sure that we feel good about how to read these tables. Okay. So in table 1, we see reported stereotypes and personal beliefs. by group. Okay, so here we see this is for Christians. This first column, if you're unfamiliar with certain terminology, these are called columns, right? Think about architecture. We have like Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, right? They go up and down. Okay. And then we have rows that go horizontally. Okay. So in terms of columns, we have Christians, atheists, Jews, and Muslims, right? And then in terms of rows, we see that the first set of rows are for the social stereotypes, and the last set of rows are for personal beliefs. Okay. And then within the social stereotypes and personal beliefs, we have those same 4 features. Okay. And remember, we get these scores because all of our participants in the study, right, from MTurk, were rating on a scale, right? All right. And then what we do is we just, take all the numbers, all the ratings, just run some statistics. We can discuss statistics in another session. Also, I can just teach you how to use SPSS. Okay, but in any case, this is how we get these values here and how we do the statistics. Okay, and let's go ahead and practice understanding or interpreting what this means. Okay, so let's start one by one. We see in the first top row, for social stereotypes, competence in science for Christians, right? We see that this is negative, right? There's a negative here. And these asterisks indicate that this is a significant finding, okay? So Christians are negatively stereotyped on this with respect to this attribute. And this is a significant finding. Okay, so we can just read from this table, even if we didn't have the figure, we can see that Christians are negatively stereotyped as being lower than average in terms of their competence in science than the average person. Okay. Here we also see that Christians are lower than the average person with respect to trust in science. Okay. And again, see that that's a negative value here. Okay. Here we see that Christians are rated as higher than average in terms of warmth. Okay. And then here we see that this is not a significant finding, or their competence is about as equal to the average person. Okay. So Christians are rated lower in terms of competence in science and trust in science, but higher than average in terms of warmth. And this is just equally as average. Okay. And then these are the personal beliefs right here. Okay. And similarly over here. Okay, we see that for atheists, we have competence in science. This is a positive value and it's significant. So we can see that atheists are stereotyped as being higher than average in terms of their competence in science. Okay. We also see here that atheists are rated as higher in trust of science than the average person. Okay. And then here we see that atheists are rated lower than the average person in terms of their warmth, because we have a negative value here. And these are all statistically significant results, okay? And then general competence, atheists are as competent as the average person, okay? And you should feel comfortable now, right? Seeing how to read these figures, right? These are statistically significant. So these are the ones that you're looking for. And then also this tells you in what direction, right? Whether this is lower than average or higher than average, okay? Or if this is going in a negative or positive direction. Okay. All right. And just for the sake of time, we'll skip the rest of the rows in the columns. If you have any questions, just send me an email. Okay, so that was experiment 1. We have 4 more experiments to go. Okay, so this is experiment 2. The purpose of experiment 2 was to investigate the impact of social stereotypes on personal identification with science. Okay, so in study 1, we were just investigating or exploring what the stereotypes of these different groups were. Okay, who's good at science, who's bad at science according to social stereotypes. Now what we're going to do in this study is see how social stereotypes impact personal identification with science. Okay, do these stereotypes influence how I might either identify or not identify with science? We'll see in the study. So in this study, 100 participants were recruited, but instead of MTurk, they were just recruited from an undergraduate psychology course. Participants were randomly assigned to one of three conditions, either a high threat condition, low threat condition, or a no article condition, okay? And the high threat and low threat conditions are gonna have articles, and then the no article condition is just not gonna have an article, okay? So the high threat condition, participants first read an article, allegedly published by the local newspaper, presented as background information. The article described the results of a bogus poll, suggesting that most students at the university, 78% of students, believed Christians were bad at science. Okay. And in the low threat condition, participants read an article, an identical article, right? But this time, the wording in the article, instead of saying most university students believe Christians are bad at science, the low threat condition is going to say most university students believe Christians are good at science. Okay, so you can see how if a Christian reads an article that says most students think Christians are bad at science, that's going to be more threatening. But if Christians read an article that suggests that most students think Christians are good at science, then that's less threatening, right? So that's why we have a high threat and a low threat condition. That's how we create these different threat conditions, okay? And then we have a no article condition where we're just gonna have some participants not read an article, either a high threat or low threat. We're just gonna have them skip that part and just go straight to the dependent measure, okay? And remember that the dependent measure is just those measures that should move or be dependent on the threat conditions, okay? So by hypothesis, like if I have you read a threatening article, or I have you read a non-threatening article, that should influence your subsequent behavior, right? Like maybe after you read the threatening article, you're more likely to act way X, whereas if you read the non-threatening article, you're more likely to act in way Y. Well, we'll measure X and Y with dependent measures, okay? So that's what these dependent measures are, okay? So what we're trying to do here is trying to measure the differential response from these different conditions, okay? So the dependent measures that were used in this article were the following. Participants completed a 20-item self-reported measure of their identification with science, okay? So for example, one item is the following: I am quite good at science, right? And how would you rate that? Would you rate that low or would you rate that high, right? If you rate that high, then that's positively scored, right? For a measure of your self-identification with science, right? If on a scale from like 1 to 3 or 1 to 7, I rate myself a 7 out of 7, right? With respect to this item, I am quite good at science, 7 out of 7. Well, that means that I self-identify with science very strongly, right? So that measure is meant to capture that, okay? Another way to capture my identification with science is not with a positively scored item or a normally scored item, but with a reverse or negatively scored item, such as I have never been very excited about science, okay? And then here, what would be an indicator of high self-identification with science is if I rated this item very low, right? If I read this item, I have never been very excited about science. No way, right? That's not true. I love science, so I'm going to rate that low, right? And if I rate that low, then that captures the fact that I strongly self-identify with science, okay? And so you can see how we're going to have items that are going to be positively scored and negatively scored. And if we have a nice participant, they're going to score high on the positively scored items and score low on the negatively scored items, giving a strong self-identification, or vice versa, weak self-identification, okay? And by hypothesis, these measures should vary depending on what threat condition we were just put through, okay? And because I'm not just feeding you results, right? I don't just want to give you facts to memorize, but rather I want us to learn how to do these studies, right? How to be cognitive scientists. I'm providing you with the citation here for where you can get these items. Okay, so check out Marsh and O'Neill, 1984, if you're interested in borrowing dependent measures for such a study. Okay, all right, so that's our purpose and our methods. Let's see what the results are. We see that figure 3 provides us with some results regarding self-identification with science based on threat conditions. Okay, and before we read the results, let's go ahead and look at the figure. We see in figure 3 on the X or horizontal axis, we have the high threat condition, no article condition, and the low threat condition. Okay, we see that the darkest shaded box represents Christians and the lighter shaded box represents non-Christians. Okay, we see here that in the high threat condition, right, remember that the high threat condition is when participants read the article that stated most students believe Christians are bad at science. The low threat condition, remember, it says that it was the newspaper article that stated most Christians are good at science. Okay, and this is the no article condition where they didn't read any article. Okay, here we see that Christians identified significantly less with science than non-Christians, right? So we see that on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we have the identification with science score. So up here, 6 would be strongly identify with science. 1 would be weakly identify with science, okay? And we see in the high threat condition that non-Christians, right, rated up here and Christians down here. Okay, so Christians identified with science significantly less than non-Christians did. Okay. Interestingly enough, in the low threat condition, right, we see that there was no significant difference between Christians and non-Christians in terms of identification with science. Okay. And then in the no article condition, we see that Christians identified less with science than non-Christians. Okay. So, another way to think about these results is when the participants didn't read any article and they just completed the dependent measures for self-identification with science, in this no article condition, Christians still identified with science less than non-Christians, okay? But when they read the low threat article, when they read the article that said most university students think Christians are good at science, right? That removed this sort of difference here, okay? And that then put us sort of at equal footing, okay? Where Christians and non-Christians identify with science about the same here. Okay. But then in the high threat condition, right, where they read the article that stated most university students believe Christians are bad at science, that brought it back down, right, to sort of this default setting where Christians self-identify with science less than non-Christians. Okay. So interesting result. And if we read, this is also why it's important to read the wording of the stimulus, right? I think this largely has to do with the fact that in the low threat condition, we see that, it's stated that most university students believe Christians were good at science. Okay, it didn't say neutral at science. It was like a positive descriptor there, right? And so that moves us from here to here. Okay, but then when we replace good with bad, we go back to here. Okay. So interesting. Here we see that depending on the threat condition, high threat versus low threat, this can influence self-identification with science. All right, awesome. The next 3 experiments are going to investigate the impact of stereotypes on scientific performance. Okay, and the reason why we're going to have 3 studies here is because if we just do one study, for example, like say we want to investigate the impact of social stereotypes on scientific performance, well, then we have a question like, what is scientific performance? How do we measure it? Okay, and maybe in one study, I want to use like a math criteria. Well, science is your ability to do math. Okay, well, we could just use that, right? Like if we just used mathematical ability, that would definitely capture something in terms of scientific abilities, but it may not capture, we might not be fully convinced, right? So that's why we want to not just sort of rest the results of a study, rest our results, our theoretical results on one study, but rather replicate and extend so we can have develop increasing evidence and a stronger motivation to believe that this phenomena is the case. Okay, so for example, instead of conducting one study where we're assessing scientific performance based on math, well, we can now use different criteria to evaluate scientific performance, right? Maybe I'll use math in one study, but then I'll use GRE scores in another study. Maybe I'll use syllogisms in a third study, right? And these might hint at different aspects of scientific performance. And if we see that negative stereotypes lead to degraded performance across all these studies, then we have increasing evidence and increasing belief in this finding that negative stereotypes hinders scientific performance, right? Cognitive ability more generally, and it's not just particular to math, right? It's not just like so stereotypes impair math ability, but not other abilities, right? It just helps by doing 3 studies here. It just allows us to have increasing support for the theoretical result from the article. Okay. Some of my students in office hours have been asking questions about measures, like how do we measure power? How do we measure scientific performance? So that's why I'm raising this, because what we may want to do as collaborators is do a study, which includes numerous studies, right? So that way we can provide strong support for the theoretical result that we want to prove or that we want to show, okay, that we want to demonstrate. Okay, so again, here we want to just investigate the impact of stereotypes, negative stereotypes on scientific performance. Does the negative stereotype about Christians actually impair their performance on exams, for example? So in this first study, this first of last 3 studies, this is experiment 3. The method that was used was 183 participants were recruited from Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, either a high threat condition or a low threat condition. Participants in the high threat condition read a paragraph stating that Christians perform worse on scientific reasoning tasks than non-Christians. So very similar to the previous study where we're going to have in the threat conditions, have participants read scenarios, okay, or a paragraph, okay. So in the high threat condition, they're going to read a paragraph that says Christians perform worse on scientific reasoning, right, like syllogisms, okay, than non-Christians. In the low threat condition, participants read a paragraph stating that no performance differences between Christians and non-Christians exist, okay. So we have participants in these different conditions, and then what we're going to do is then after they read these paragraphs, depending on their condition, they're going to complete dependent measures. Okay, we're going to see how these different conditions influence these dependent measures, right? And again, think about, what do we want for a dependent measure here, right? Think about what the purpose of our experiment is. We want to measure the impact of social stereotypes on scientific performance. So our dependent measure here has to be something that's trying to measure scientific performance, okay? So what they did in this study was participants completed a scientific reasoning test that involved indicating whether 15 syllogisms reflected either good or poor reasoning. Okay, so for example, I feed you this syllogism: all ghosts are electrified. No cats are electrified. Therefore, no ghost is a cat. Right? And you just have to answer, is that good? Does that reflect good reasoning or poor reasoning? Okay, and I give you 15 of those. The total number of correct solutions serves as the dependent measure. Okay, so how out of the 15, how many syllogisms can you answer correctly or identify correctly? And then finally, in this study, participants also completed a demographic survey and a suspicion probe. Okay. See if they have any suspicions about the study. Okay, sometimes we'll exclude participants for this reason. Okay. And again, if you're interested in where we get the syllogisms, right? Say you want to do a replication of the study, you can go ahead and check out Markman and colleagues 2007, this article right here. Okay. And just to point out for fun, we see that Galinsky is one of the authors across many studies that we've covered in the course so far, right? We also saw Galinsky as the first author on the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels. Okay. The 2013 article we read on slurs. All right, so let's take a look at the results now. So we see figure 4 on the horizontal or x-axis, we have the high threat condition and the low threat condition. Okay. On the vertical or y-axis, we have the number of correct responses for the 15 syllogisms. So either 0 correct or 15 correct. Okay. And Christians are represented in the darkest shaded box. Non-Christians are represented in the lightest shaded box. And what do we see? We see here that in the high threat condition, Christians demonstrated lower performance on solving syllogisms than non-Christians. Okay. However, Christians demonstrated equal performance on solving syllogisms as non-Christians in the low threat condition. So in this low threat condition, when participants read a paragraph stating that no performance differences existed between Christians and non-Christians, guess what? When they read that, this showed also in their performance on syllogisms, right? They performed just as well, right? This is not a statistically significant difference here, right? They performed just as well, right? When they were in that low threat condition. However, when they were in the high threat condition, when they read that Christians perform worse on scientific reasoning, and then they had to solve the syllogisms, guess what? We now see that Christians indeed perform worse than non-Christians on that task. Okay, it was very interesting, right? That depending on the threat condition, this influences your performance. Okay. All right, so that's at least so far one study that suggests that negative stereotypes do impact scientific performance of Christians. Okay. But again, we want to make sure that this result isn't idiosyncratic or a fluke result. So let's go ahead and replicate and extend this result by having threat conditions as in the previous study, but this time we're going to use a different measure for scientific performance. Okay, so that's what we're going to do in experiment 4. Experiment 4 recruits 128 participants using Amazon's mechanical turk. In the high threat condition, participants read a paragraph stating that Christians perform worse on scientific reasoning than non-Christians. Okay. And in the low threat condition, participants read a paragraph stating that Christians perform worse on intuitive thinking tasks than non-Christians. Okay, so here, what's going on in this scenario, instead of saying Christians are good at, so notice here, the high threat and low threat condition, the high threat condition said Christians perform worse than non-Christians. And the low threat, it said that there was no performance difference, right? Here, we're going to try something a little bit different. And in the high threat condition, we're just going to say that Christians perform worse on scientific reasoning And the low threat will say that Christians perform worse on intuitive thinking. So here, notice that this is a classification difference on the task that they're about to do. Okay, so imagine that I'm going to give the same assignment, right? But in one condition, I'm going to call it scientific reasoning, and in another, we'll call it intuitive thinking. Okay. So here, the dependent measure, okay, instead of solving syllogisms, the dependent measure in experiment 4 was the participants completed 10 remote associates tests, okay, RAT items. And these items are taken from Craig, Galinsky, and Wong, 2006, in which they were given, right, the participants were given 3 words, and then the participant has to generate a 4th word that's related to the 3. Okay, so here's some examples that I took from Craig, Galinsky, and Wong from this article right here. Okay, envy, golf, beans. Those are the 3 words you're given. Now you have to generate a 4th word that's related to those 3. And here's like a possible answer. So green, right? Envy, golf, beans, right? Envy is green, like, I'm green with envy. Golf, on the green. I'm going to go play on the green. And beans, green beans, yum, right? Similarly for page, blank, white, lines, right? Blank page, white page, lines on a page, right? So with these first 3, I can generate this 4th, page. Third example, chocolate, fortune, tin. You got to generate a 4th word, cookie. And the final example, broken, clear, eye, glass, right? Broken glass, clear glass, eyeglass. Okay. So this is different than the syllogistic reasoning, right? But this also might be a way to measure scientific ability, scientific performance, whatnot. Okay. So the participants completed this RAT test, right? These dependent measures, but they were either told that they were Christians are worse at scientific reasoning or intuitive thinking. And let's take a look at figure 5 for the results. On the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, we see that we have the high threat condition and then the low threat condition. In the vertical or y-axis, we have the number of reasoning associate test items, right? RAT items that were solved, okay, out of 10. So if I give you 10 of these, how many can you solve? All right. And again, we see that Christians are in the darker shaded box and non-Christians are in the lighter shaded box. And what are the results that we see? Well, we see that Christians demonstrated lower performance on solving RAT items than non-Christians when they were told that the RAT items measured scientific reasoning. Okay, so if you're a Christian and you think that this RAT test, right, the remote associates test, is a measure for scientific reasoning, you're going to do worse, right? After you read the paragraph that suggests that Christians are worse at scientific reasoning than non-Christians, right? However, if you're told that this is intuitive thought, right? Christians demonstrate equal performance on solving RAT items and non-Christians. Okay. So very interesting. All right, and we see that here in the low threat condition, Christians demonstrated equal performance on solving RAT items as non-Christians when they were told that the RAT items measured intuitive thought rather than scientific reasoning. Okay, but when they were told that that test measured scientific reasoning instead of intuitive thought, they performed significantly worse than non-Christians. Okay, very interesting. And again, the measure of scientific performance here was using the RAT instead of syllogistic reasoning. Okay, so this is a second study that used different measures for scientific performance, right? And slightly different threat conditions. but also found a similar result, right? In that the higher threat regarding stereotypes um, leads to degraded performance, whereas a low threat does not. Okay. So again, we see that negative stereotypes cause Christians to underperform in science. Awesome. Let's go ahead and do one more replication and extension to really drive this point home. Okay, so this final experiment, experiment 5, also investigates the impact of social stereotypes on scientific performance. Okay, but this time, instead of solving syllogisms or instead of solving RAT items, this part's gonna assess scientific performance using the analytical section from the GRE, okay, the graduate record examination. 107 participants were recruited, this time from an undergraduate psychology course. A week prior to the study, participants completed an online demographic survey, which included 5 religiosity questions administered on a scale from 1 for not at all religious to 11, extremely religious. Okay. And the religiosity questionnaire, right? It's what it's aiming to do here is to assess the extent to which you're extremely religious, right? Because, you know, there could be a group of Christians, but the individual Christians may vary in the extremity of their religious beliefs, right? Like one Christian may be strongly Christian, right? And another Christian may not believe so strongly, or they might not identify so strongly. Okay, so here we're going to include a questionnaire, religiosity questionnaire. Okay. And an example item from this questionnaire is, what is the general importance of God in your life? Is this extremely important, 11 out of 11, or 1 out of 11? Not at all important. Okay. The day before the study, participants were emailed again, this time with instructions to take the study in one of the 2 places. So the participants are going to take the GRE questions on campus, but in one of 2 buildings, depending on the condition. Okay. The high threat condition, right? Like in the previous studies, we want a high threat and a low threat condition. In the high threat condition, we're going to have participants, Christians in particular, take the analytical section of the GRE in the physical sciences building, right? And in the low threat condition, we'll have them take this analytical section of the GRE in the divinity school. Okay. And we understand why this is a high threat and a low threat condition, because if you're a Christian, then the divinity school is going to feel like home for you, right? And it's going to be a low threat environment for you. You probably spend a lot of your day, perhaps every day, all day in this environment, right? Doing courses, giving lectures, hanging out with fellow Christians and whatnot. On the other hand, maybe you only took 1 course in the physical sciences building, right? Like, because that's not your main thing. Okay. So you can see how this is going to be a high threat condition for the Christians, having them in the physical sciences building. Okay. So it's always fun thinking about, right, depending on our hypothesis, how can we create a high threat condition here, right? And a low threat condition. And this is a nice article because we get to see 3 different ways in which they've done this. Okay. Finally, to increase awareness of the context, high threat versus low threat, upon arrival to the assigned building on testing day, all participants read an adapted mission statement of the relevant department. Okay, notice that these earlier instructions were provided via email a day and a week in advance. Okay, so just to make sure that the participants were aware of the threat condition, that same day that they showed up to campus for the exam, before taking the exam, they read a mission statement for the respective department. Okay, so if you go to the physical sciences building, before you take the exam, you're going to read the mission statement for the physical sciences department. And if you go to the divinity school, before you take the exam, you're going to read a mission statement for the divinity school. Okay, and this is just going to help you get really clear before you take the exam of the threat, whether it's high or low threat. Okay. All right, cool. Now that we have our conditions, high threat and low threat condition, we need a measure, right, to see how if participants react differently based on the condition, right? We need a way to measure that difference. So this is going to be the dependent measure in this study, right? Remember, again, we want to assess scientific performance, right? And so think, what are different ways we can measure scientific performance? In this last experiment, they used the analytical section, 10 questions from the analytical section of the GRE, the graduate record examination. Okay, and then here's an example question. Okay, David ranks 7th from the top and 28th from the bottom in a class. How many students are there in the class? And here are your optional answers, right? 36, 35, 34, cannot be determined, none of the above. Okay, and you have 10 of those questions to answer. Okay, and our question as researchers is, if I have Christians take this quiz or this exam in the physical sciences building after they read a physical sciences mission statement, will they perform differently than if they took the same exact exam in the divinity school after reading a divinity school mission statement? Okay, that's what we're trying to figure out here. And let's go ahead and look at our results. Okay, so here, the top figure right here is the results for non-Christians. Okay, so we split up the results here. The top figure is just all non-Christians. And based on their religiosity score, right? Remember, even the non-Christians rated like how religious they are, right? And, as non-Christians, we're not going to see significant difference here. Since they're not Christians, we don't see a significant difference here, okay? We're going to see the significant difference here among the Christians, okay? And so we see a greater difference among Christians between those that have low religiosity and high religiosity, okay? And we see that those that were rated, well, let me backtrack just a second, because before I explain the results, let me explain what these bars mean on the right, okay? So the top figures for non-Christians, bottom figures for Christians. Over here, we see that this solid line represents the high threat, okay? The physical sciences building, okay? And the dotted line represents the low threat, okay? Taking the exam in the divinity school. Okay, similarly here, right? The solid line represents taking the exam in the physical sciences building, whereas the low threat represents taking the exam in the divinity school. Okay, now we can read the results here. Okay, and I've provided the wording here for you to the left of the figure, so you can take your time. If you're a student in my class, just grab this set of slides from the file section, and you can see the results for this here and the results for this figure explained right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the bottom first, because it's a more interesting result, and then we'll talk about the top after that. Okay, so here we see that Christians higher in religiosity, right? So I'm going to start on the right and then work my way to the left. Okay, so Christians higher in religiosity. So on this questionnaire right here, what is the general importance of God in your life? Those that rated 11, right? Extremely important, right? We see that those Christians, right, higher in religiosity, demonstrated lower performance on solving GRE items than Christians lower in religiosity. When Christians had to take their tests in the physical sciences building, and they had to read mission statements from the physical sciences. Okay, and so I just explained here this result right here. Okay, so for those Christians that had to take the GRE in the physical sciences building, we see that those Christians that are more religious did significantly worse, whereas those that were less religious did significantly better. Okay. And we see here that performance on the GRE is on the vertical or y-axis. Okay. Remember that there's 10 questions on the GRE, and on the vertical or y-axis, we see that it goes from 0 to 10. Okay. So this is the score, right? And interestingly enough, Christians higher in religiosity demonstrated equal performance as Christians lower in religiosity when Christians had to take their test in the divinity school and they had to read mission statements for the divinity school. Okay. In other words, when Christians were taking the GRE in the divinity school, their religiosity did not impact their performance. Okay. And that's why we see this rather flat horizontal dotted line here, right? Because when you're, so what this means is, like, say you're a Christian and I'm a Christian, for example, just for example, okay? But you're you strongly you answer strongly for this religiosity questionnaire, and I answer weakly. Maybe I'm kind of a Christian, but not really, but you're like really committed. Okay. Well, as long as we're taking our GRE in the divinity school, then it doesn't really matter, right? Like, you won't be negatively impacted as long as we're both taking our quiz in the divinity school, right? However, if we take the quiz in the physical sciences building, right, it's going to have a negative impact on your performance, right? And I'll have a less I'll be able to do relatively better compared to you. Okay. So that's very interesting that we see this result. Okay. And then up top, this is a less interesting result in that non-Christians, both in the high threat and low threat condition, essentially perform like Christians do in the low threat condition. Okay. So in other words, just to be very clear, non-Christians higher in religiosity, so non-Christians that are rated higher on this questionnaire, religiosity questionnaire, demonstrated equal performance as non-Christians in religiosity when they had to take their tests in the physical sciences building. Okay. But similarly, when they had to take the test in the divinity school. Okay. So if we're both non-religious, then when we take our quizzes or our GRE in the physical sciences building, it doesn't negatively impact you. And also, if we take the same GRE in the divinity school, doesn't negatively impact you either. Okay. Whereas if you're strongly religious, it will negatively impact you in this Christian group, right? If you're a strongly devoted Christian, and I'm not a strongly devoted Christian, then your performance will be hindered only in the physical sciences building, but not in the divinity school. Okay, which is the finding that we see here. Okay. So again, very clearly, we see that how religious you are, right? This impacts the threat condition here, right? Has an impact on you depending on how religious you are. Okay. Cool. So I think that's very clear. And I don't want to just sort of keep repeating the same result. So let's go ahead and now summarize the findings from today. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and in the last two slides provide a summary of the purpose and result from experiments 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. All right. So experiment 1 investigated the social stereotypes and personal beliefs about different groups. Experiment 1 found that Christians were perceived to be stereotyped as lower in competence in science and lower in trust in science than atheists, Jews, and Muslims. Okay, remember that this was about general stereotypes and personal beliefs about groups. Experiment 2 investigated the impact of social stereotypes on personal identification with science. And the experiment 2 found that Christians identified significantly less with science than non-Christians in the high threat condition, but not in the low threat condition. And recall that the high threat condition in this study was after reading a newspaper saying that Christians are bad at science. And the low threat condition in this study was after reading a newspaper saying that Christians are good at science. Experiment 3 investigated the impact of social stereotypes on scientific performance using syllogisms to measure scientific performance. Experiment 3 found that Christians demonstrated lower performance on solving syllogisms than non-Christians in the high threat condition, but not in the low threat condition. And recall the high threat condition in this study was after reading a newspaper saying that Christians are bad at reasoning, and the low threat condition in this study was after reading a newspaper saying that Christians are good at reasoning. Experiment 4 investigated the impact of social stereotypes on scientific performance, but this time scientific performance was measured using items from the RAT, or the Remote Associates Test. Experiment 4 found that Christians demonstrated lower performance on solving RAT items than non-Christians in the high threat condition, but not in the low threat condition. And in this study, the high threat condition was when the RAT items were labeled as scientific reasoning, and the low threat condition was when the RAT items were labeled as intuitive thinking. And then finally, experiment 5 investigated the impact of social stereotypes on scientific performance yet again, but this time measured scientific performance in terms of 10 items from the analytical section of the GRE, or the Graduate Record Examination. And experiment 5 found that Christians higher in religiosity demonstrated lower performance on solving GRE items than Christians lower in religiosity, when Christians had to take their tests in the physical sciences building and they had to read mission statements for the physical sciences. So collectively, this set of 5 studies shows that negative stereotypes cause Christians to underperform in and disidentify with science. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture and that you found this lecture thought-provoking, right? And perhaps it'll motivate you to replicate and extend this study in some way of your own. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your attention today. In the next few lectures, we'll cover not only negative stereotypes, but we'll cover positive stereotypes too. Okay. Thanks for your attention. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture.